In this video, we're going to start our discussion of these big social questions that have moral implications associated with them. So we're going to be doing 5 of these big social ethical questions. So we're going to do euthanasia, abortion, the death penalty, affirmative action, and gun control. And for each of these topics, we're going to do a for and against, and sort of think about some of the arguments in favor of abortion and against abortion, in favor of euthanasia and against it, and then some against, right? So that is to say, we're going to do a day on for, or a lecture on for, and then a lecture on against. You'll have a reading for and against as well. I just want to note, you're free to hold whatever views you want to hold on these topics or issues. My goal is not to change your mind on anything. Really, what I'm looking for is for you to understand the arguments in favor of and the arguments against, right? And I've done my best to try to pick some of the better arguments in favor of and some of the better arguments against. Because there's interesting arguments here, right? There's interesting arguments for all of these issues. So hopefully you'll find this section interesting. One thing to note while I'm thinking about it is the paper. You have one paper to write for this class. It's not going to be due until July 25th, so you've got quite a bit of time, July 25th at 10 p.m., but it's going to be over one of these big social issues. So you'll find the instructions for the paper at the top of the Moodle page. Basically, you'll choose one of the scenarios related to one of these 5 topics. You get to choose whichever one you want to do, and you'll write an essay related to that. And there's pretty detailed instructions there, but as per usual, if you have questions about that, please feel free to set up an appointment or send me an email. I'm happy to answer your questions, whatever questions you may have. Okay, so the first big social topic that we're going to think about today is euthanasia. So euthanasia, of course, I suppose it's worth noting, euthanasia, it comes from the Greek euthanasia, eu meaning true or good, thanasia meaning death, thanos, death. So euthanasia would be like a good death, right? That's sort of what the Greek term itself means, but what it means particularly depends a little bit on the context. So there's a few different terms that we're going to use in the context of euthanasia here, right? One is what's oftentimes called active euthanasia. And this is really what we're talking about when we talk about euthanasia, is active forms of euthanasia. And there's sort of 2 versions of active euthanasia. There's physician-assisted suicide, PAS, physician-assisted suicide, and then there's voluntary or physician-mediated euthanasia. We'll just call it voluntary euthanasia. So physician-assisted suicide is when a medical doctor, a physician, prescribes a terminal patient some medicine, some drugs that they can take, and if they take, will bring about their death, right? So typically this will happen with someone who has, a month or 2 left to live. They're prescribed this, and if the pain gets to be too much, they can choose to take those drugs and end their life, right? Voluntary euthanasia is basically the same thing, except for a doctor comes and administers the drugs directly to you. So physician-assisted suicide, the patient does it to herself. Voluntary euthanasia, the doctor does it to her, right? That's the difference. Sometimes people talk about euthanasia in the terms of what's called passive euthanasia. I'm writing it small up here because we're not really going to talk about this because it seems to be a separate issue. At least it seems to me to be a separate issue. Passive euthanasia is when you actively withdraw treatment for someone, right? So maybe they're on a breathing machine and you take away that breathing machine, or they're being treated by some sort of cancer treatment and you pull those treatments away, whatever the case may be. This is more letting someone die, right? Letting that natural process of death take over. And letting someone die. What we're really going to be interested in our discussions about euthanasia is active euthanasia in both forms, right? Whether it be physician-assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia where the physician does it to the patient. That's really what we're interested in and concerned with, is this question of active euthanasia. Okay, so Today we're considering James Rachel's arguments in favor of euthanasia. And he gives three, right? One of which he thinks is really strong, but not as intellectually sort of grounded. Another one which he thinks is more intellectually grounded, but problematic. And then a final one that he settles on that he thinks sort of meets in the middle between the two. So the one that he thinks is strongest is what he calls the argument from mercy. And this is more or less an appeal to the gut, right? It goes something like this. Terminally ill patients suffer from a lot of pain, right? Dying is not comfortable. It's not quick. It's not easy. It's not simple, right? And the argument goes, just like with pets, with dogs, with cats, whatever, when we see them in pain, we say, wouldn't it be better if that pain were ended, right? And so the argument from mercy says, look, if someone wants it and they're in a lot of pain, wouldn't it be merciful to end their life, right? Wouldn't it be merciful to just let them die now rather than have to linger for another month in pain, and pain that can only be so well managed by analgesics, by opioids or whatever, right? So the argument goes, euthanasia is an act of mercy, right? And mercy is something that we think is good, is valuable, is ethical, moral. And so it follows, if that's true, that euthanasia is something that we should allow, right? Of course, this is a bit of a problematic argument insofar as it mostly appeals to the gut, right? It mostly appeals to just sort of your sense of, yeah, that would suck, right? That's more or less what the sort of course of the argument there. And in some ways it's a little bit question-begging. It sort of assumes that it's a merciful and therefore good thing to do. But that's precisely precisely the issue that's in question, is whether or not it is indeed merciful, indeed the right thing to do. So it's not necessarily the strongest potential argument for that reason, but it seems to me that this is the main reason why Rachel thinks that we should have euthanasia, because he thinks that it's merciful, right? That's more or less his reasoning. But he acknowledges that may not convince someone who's against euthanasia. Okay, so that's the argument from mercy. I should note, hopefully you wrote down a little bit more than just argument from mercy, so that you have some additional notes that you can use if it came to an exam. If you didn't do that, rewind the video and watch it again. That's the advantage of video lectures. Okay. Number 2, this is the utilitarian argument. This is the one that he thinks is more intellectually well put together, but he has some objections to. He's going to have some issues with it. And basically it goes like this. Dying people have lots of pain. Death ends that pain. Utilitarianism says, you'll recall from our lecture on Mill, from our discussion about Mill, that we should try to increase happiness or pleasure as much as we can, or decrease pain as much as possible. So if death ends that pain, then death is good on the utilitarian principle, because it reduces the net amount of pain in the world, right? Because dying people have a lot of pain. Death will end it, so death is good. And so we should actively pursue death. I'm going to write it like this. Actively bring about death. That's euthanasia, right? Why would it be good then? Well, because it reduces the amount of suffering in the world, right? And it's interesting to note that arguably it reduces the amount of suffering not only for the patient herself or himself, but also for the patient's family, who no longer have to see that patient suffer anymore, right? We oftentimes say, once someone dies after a long illness, we'll say something like, well, at least they're not suffering anymore, I can take some solace in that, right? So, it would maybe bring about some happiness among the family members, right, to know that suffering has ended, right? Okay. There's a few issues here, though, right? And Rachel's himself is worried about this as an argument. So one worry is, I guess we'll call this A, letter A. Worry A, objection A, is that this might imply that killing a miserable person is good, even if they don't want it, right? So suppose that someone was dying, miserable and dying and in a lot of pain, but they don't want euthanasia, right? This implies that it might still be good to go ahead and kill them. Why? Well, because death is going to end that pain, right? Whether they want it or not, right? And that seems problematic, right? Because we assume that euthanasia should only be ethical, should only be legal, provided that it would only be moral, provided that the patient herself or himself chooses it or wants it or is competent to choose it and want it and therefore does. So doing it against someone's will, even if it reduces the amount of pain, the utilitarian argument says, yep, that's good. Doesn't matter about your intentions, doesn't matter about autonomy. What matters is just getting that pain down, right? It's not clear that that would actually be good at the end of the day, right? So he's worried about the argument for that reason. He also brings up this interesting point. I'll just call it the religion argument. He says, suppose that it were true that if the world had fewer religions, that there would be more happiness, right? Or vice versa, if everybody was Muslim, if everybody was Catholic, or everybody was Jewish, then the world would be happier, right? That's not, therefore, a reason to force everybody to be Jewish or Catholic or Muslim or to have no religion whatsoever, because we want people to be able to freely choose their religion, right? So what he says there is, look, that religion argument, it doesn't cut necessarily against this argument. It just says that utilitarian framework is problematic, right? It's missing something. There's some sort of issue with it. It's missing something important. Okay. So what's then the final argument that he gives? The argument that he thinks sort of hits the sweet spot here. I'm going to erase all of this here. The argument that he thinks is ultimately the best argument is what he calls the best interests argument. The best interest arguments go something like this. So 1. If an action is in the best interests of everyone involved and violates nobody's rights, then it's acceptable. I'll write it like this. Then it's morally okay. Or morally acceptable is fine, right? Okay, so let's just pause and figure out what the heck this means. So if an action is in the best interest of everyone involved and it violates nobody's rights, then it's morally okay. It's morally permissible. It's allowable for you to do that thing. So I think I'm going to have a salad for lunch here in just a little bit. That's in the best interest of everyone involved. It's hopefully going to be somewhat healthy for me. It's not going to violate anybody's rights. I purchased the salad at fair market value. It seems like it's morally okay for me to eat that salad, right? That seems true. Okay. The second claim then is that in some cases, euthanasia, that is active euthanasia, meets both requirements. So in some cases, euthanasia meets both those requirements. That is to say that it's in the best interest of everyone involved, right? So suppose that you have, let me just say, it meets the best interest of everyone involved and it violates nobody's rights, right? Okay, so what might be an example of this? For Rachel's, I would say it's probably something like this, right? Suppose that there's someone who's had a long illness, right? Their family is exhausted after caring for them for several years, and has had negative impacts on their personal relationships, their professional relationships, whatever the case may be. So it's in the best interest of everyone involved that this person can die, right? So that she herself says, I don't want to suffer anymore. I want you guys to be able to move on with your lives and start moving forward. It violates nobody's rights. She has a right to life, but it's not violating that right if she says it's okay for me to die now. Arguably, children perhaps have a right to their parents, but if the parents are elderly, they no longer need them in the same sort of way, right? So it seems like there's situations which meet this, and if this principle is true, and there are no rights being violated in these cases, then it just follows from this that euthanasia is sometimes okay. That is to say, it's sometimes morally okay, right? In those cases where it doesn't violate anybody's rights, where it is in their best interest, the patient's best interest, the family's best interest, in those cases, it seems like euthanasia is okay. That's Rachel's central argument, right? Okay, that's all for this video. In the next one, we'll think about some arguments against euthanasia.